Welcome to Tradition and Sanity. Vatican II as cause of cultural revolution. Questioning the victim narrative. Was the council hijacked by a hostile culture, or was it a sine qua non for that culture's emergence? It has been fashionable to present the Church's leaders in the 1960s and 70s as victims of that period's tremendous cultural change, especially insofar as it prevented the realization of the Council's putative promise. The standard conservative account is that Vatican II itself was fine, but then the Church got blindsided by the spirit of 1968, and that threw off everything. The Council was hijacked and derailed. The world unexpectedly exploded with the sexual revolution after the Council and sucked it into the maelstrom. I believe we have every reason to call this narrative into question, indeed, to hold that the opposite is true. It is far more likely that it was Vatican II that precipitated 1968, in the sense that the one institution in the Western world that had unequivocally represented timeless order, stability, tradition, even if people hated it, suddenly seemed to be re-examining everything from the ground up. As a friend of mine puts it, the Council, and especially the liturgical reform, betokened a great unfreeze in which all that had been held as sacred, normative, and unchangeable, or at least taken for granted, was now up for review, criticism, revision. Even if the goal, at least for the majority, was to reaffirm the same truths using a new language adapted to modern man. The gathering of over 2,000 prelates under a pope, pursuing the motto of aggiornamento, was the green light to a total re-examination of Western culture and society, a re-examination that quickly degenerated into a rejection of norms, strictures, customs, and heritage. Rather than being poor, blind-sided victims, the Church's leaders in the period from 1958 to 1968 are more aptly characterized as generators or agitators of the cultural change that finally erupted in 68 and has continued its course of dissolution ever since. Destabilizing the foundations. Arguably, the two most stable areas of social life, where change is the slowest and least observable under normal circumstances, are the forms of worship and the relations between the sexes. This is to be expected. The relation of the sexes is the foundation of natural social life, and the worship of God is the core activity of supernatural social life. By mandating, authorizing, or permitting radical changes and disruptions in precisely these areas, churchmen opened the way for the dark forces to tear through what remained of Western civilization. In my book, Ministers of Christ, I bring out the intimate connection between divine worship and the relations between the sexes, and therefore the enormous potential for cross-contamination from one sphere to the other. Imagine what will happen if the Catholic Church, where both of these spheres had remained very stable compared to the social experiments outside of the true Church, decides to unlock and unloose bimillennial patterns of religious worship and fundamental Judeo-Christian norms about the sexes. If a 13-year-old doesn't know whether she is growing into a man or a woman, it may be in part because her priest suffers from similar confusion about the conditions necessary for the ordination he received. The conditions needed for liturgical representation of Christ, the bridegroom, as these apply to all ministers in the sanctuary. If the priest is confused, it is because he belongs to an institution that has opened itself to rejection of tradition, to experimentation, and to a profound confusion that seeps into the consciousness of all believers. We can see confirmation of our thesis in the way in which the liturgical reform affected other Christian denominations. Former Anglican cleric and now Catholic priest Father John Hunnick reminds us that liturgical deterioration in the Catholic Church almost always prompts deterioration in the separated Christian bodies. He uses the Anglicans as an example. In other words, the Catholic Church sets the tone for Christianity as a whole. And in many ways, it sets the tone for the West in general, or at least it used to, before squandering its political capital. The revolutionism of 1968 could not have occurred without the critical self-examination of Vatican II erupting first. It was not the other way around, as some still foolishly say. Guillaume Couchot's research. Do we have scholarly support for this thesis? Yes, in fact, we do, in the work of many sociologists. The most impressive may well be the award-winning French scholar Guillaume Couchet, who is not to be suspected of traditionalism, as he is a member of the editorial board of the Jesuit review Études and conducts his research with scrupulous neutrality, his conclusions tentatively framed on the basis of vast analysis of data. In a book entitled How Our World Has Ceased to Be Christian, Anatomy of a Collapse, he enters decisively into the debate over the spectacular collapse of the French Church, which has continued unabated for 5 decades, to the point where this country will someday consist of Muslims and traditionalist Catholics, with the mainstream Church having vanished. According to Couchet, it is in the 1960s, more precisely in 1965, that the rupture inaugurating the process of Catholic decadence in France can be dated. This break coincides with the Second Vatican Council, which is paradoxical, since this council was designed by those who organized it as an aggiornamento to vivify a Catholicism confronted with the modern world. Yet, as Couchet, after examining various hypotheses, points out, quote, "We do not see what other event could have generated such a reaction. By its mere existence, to the extent that it suddenly made possible the reform of the old norms, the Council was enough to shake them, especially since the liturgical reform, which concerned the most visible part of religion for most people, began to be implemented as early as 1964. Unquote. Couchet soberly notes that it was the Church, not the secular world, that first decisively moved away from the culture of duty and obligation, regarding such things as mass attendance, frequent confession, marriage laws, and moral requirements, and ushered in a mentality of throwing off shackles. If even the Church seemed no longer absolutely certain of itself, if even she seemed to think her message had become hide-bound and threadbare, why should anyone else bother to maintain the dominant Christian social and moral norms? He notes, too, that in pockets of Catholicism where the modernizing or updating path has been resisted, the faith has been handed on more successfully. Quote, "This departure from the culture of duty and obligation, a path on which the Church has in many respects preceded the civil world, especially the school and educational world, is a fundamental event on which it would be appropriate to ponder. In families and environments where this culture of duty and obligation have been both maintained and modernized, transmission rates of the faith have often been better." Unquote. Rejection of traditional morality. Roberto de Mattei, Maria Madis, John Smeaton, and other writers have pointed out the manner in which moral teaching on marriage and family was already being called into question well before Humanae Vitae attempted, far too late, to stop up the bursting dam of dissent from traditional sexual mores. The original schema on marriage and family that was presented to the Council Fathers for review, a document thoroughly traditional and responsive to modernity in the mode of confidently and convincingly refuting its errors, was part of the body of texts forcibly rejected at the start by the liberal European faction that quickly took the reins at the Council and remained a dominant, albeit not unchecked force throughout the 4 sessions. The teaching of Gaudium et Spes sounded, against the backdrop of Leo XIII's Arcanum, Pius XI's Casti Connubii, and Pius XII's Address to Midwives, like a rather flaccid recitation of views already riddled with doubts. De Mattei observes, quote, "Examining this aspect, the conciliar event as a totality, requires us to bring a particular decade into focus. The period between 1958, the year of Pius XII's death, and 1969, the date of the promulgation of Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. 1968 is also the year of the Sorbonne Revolution, which started a real moral revolution throughout Western society. But for the Catholic world, this was not only a point of departure, but also a point of arrival. It was, in fact, preceded by the revolution in mentality and customs produced by Vatican II. The revolution of 1968 certainly had a powerful impact on the Church as well as on society, but the conciliar turning point likewise fostered the explosion of 1968 and multiplied its driving force." Unquote. The formulation here is cautious but still damning. Even if we admit that the Cultural Revolution greatly accelerated the rate of societal dissolution, it is impossible to deny that the dynamism of conciliar reform, generally in the sense of a no-holds-barred critique of the past, a repudiation of the Constantinian legacy of Christendom, and a launching of new modes of thinking, speaking, and acting, both in church and outside of church, multiplied the driving force of the spirit of 68. There was, in other words, a hand-in-hand co-causality in which the destabilization of the Church, which appeared to all as institutionally endorsed, complemented the destabilization of secular society, whose avant-garde resisted such institutions as still existed. Conservatives are quick to reply that correlation is not causation. In a tweet, Rorate Celi deftly responded, quote, "The most irritating repeated trope is that correlation is not causation, but that is not true at all. Modernity and extreme secularization were quite old by the 1960s. The Church had been the most relevant institution that had erected a dam against it. Vatican II meant the dam broke. The dam, painstakingly built since Trent, reinforced after the French Revolution, and once again by St. Pius X. And the sewage waters outside were allowed to contaminate all that had remained untouched. Vatican II did not cause modernity. It did cause destruction." Unquote. Pertinent, too, is the fact that John XXIII, quite unlike Pius XII, was soft on communism, hobnobbing with Marxists, allowing Catholics to vote for them in Italy, a total reversal of the policy of his predecessor, and ordering a secret deal with Moscow that guaranteed the Council would not condemn Soviet communism in exchange for the attendance of Russian Orthodox auditors. This behavior reflects a general fascination of post-war European intellectuals with Marx, a trait that was to prove deeply corrosive to French theology in particular, and would, of course, morph into liberation theology, a profound influence on the current Pope, who has himself expressly called for a cultural revolution in theology. Francis is the final croaking voice speaking on behalf of the radicals at Vatican II who unleashed a revolution in the Church and in the secular world. I mention the Marxist connection because the most lethal errors on marriage and the family were propounded by Marxist and communist intellectuals and implemented first and best in their societies. Pointed reflections from an archbishop. Archbishop Vigano's publications often contain brilliant passages of unique insight, and as a result, I will sometimes quote those passages with the crucial caveat that I agree only with what I am quoting and that my quoting is not a blanket endorsement. Vigano is the only churchman of whom I am aware who has written extensively about the connection between the Council and the late 1960s. His analysis supports the thesis I am advancing, adding a rich array of primary sources. In an interview with Marco Tossati in September 2020, His Excellency was asked, "Why do you see a relationship between the Second Vatican Council and the 1968 student protests?" He replies, and because this is a lengthy quotation from the Archbishop, I will simply let you know when it ends. It has many internal quotes as well. It is undeniable, even if only from a historical and sociological point of view, that there is a very close relationship between the Conciliar Revolution and 1968. The very protagonists of Vatican II admit it. Joseph Ratzinger stands out among them, writing, quote, "Adherence to a utopian anarchistic Marxism was supported on the front lines by university chaplains and student associations who saw in it the dawn of the realization of Christian hopes. The guiding light is to be found in the events of May 1968 in France. Dominicans and Jesuits were at the barricades. The intercommunion carried out at an ecumenical mass at the barricades was considered a kind of landmark in Salvation history, a kind of revelation that inaugurated a new era of Christianity. Unquote. One of the periti at the council, Father René Laurentin, wrote, quote, "The demands of the May 68 movement largely coincided with the council's grand ideas, particularly in the council's constitution on the church and the world. To a certain extent, Vatican II was already a protest against the curia by a group of bishops who were trying to create an institutionally prefabricated council." Unquote. And the Argentine theologian Father Álvaro Calderón affirmed, quote, "If there is anything that immediately stands out to those who study the Second Vatican Council, it is the change, in a liberal sense, of the concept of authority. The Pope stripped himself of his supreme authority in favor of the bishops, collegiality. The bishops stripped themselves of their authority in favor of theologians. The theologians gave up their science in favor of listening to the faithful. And the voice of the faithful is nothing more than the fruit of propaganda." Unquote. This vision is also widely and proudly affirmed on the progressive front, which saw the same demands of the conciliar revolution realized in 1968. Jacques Noyer, Bishop Emeritus of Amiens, recalls, quote, "I am convinced that the spirit that inspired the preparation, celebration, and implementation of the Second Vatican Council is a great opportunity for the Church and the world. It is the gospel offered to the men of today. Deep down, May 68 was a spiritual movement, even a mystical one, consistent with the dream of the Council." Unquote. Without a green light from the Church, the world would never have accepted or taken up the student movement's demands for rebellion. Beyond the acts of the Council, it was precisely the spirit of Vatican II that marked the end of a hierarchically constituted society and of the traditional values common to the Western world. Until then, concepts such as authority, honor, respect for the elderly, a spirit of mortification and service, a sense of duty, the defense of the family and one's fatherland were shared and, albeit in a weakened form compared to the past, still practiced. Seeing the Catholic Church, a beacon of truth and civilization for nations, throw open its doors to the world and unhesitatingly discard her glorious heritage, going so far as to revolutionize the liturgy and water down morality, was an unequivocal signal to the masses, a sort of approval of the agenda that, at the time, didn't yet dare to reveal itself completely, even though all of its distinctive signs could be grasped. It destroyed the Church and society, compromised civil and religious authority, discredited marriage and the family, ridiculed patriotism and a sense of duty, or labeled them as fascism. All amid the silence of a complicit hierarchy. Those like me who entered the seminary in the immediate post-conciliar period can testify that even the Roman pontifical seminaries were immediately conquered by this tremor of protest, emancipation, and dissolution of all rules and discipline. All the premises that were laid down in a nutshell with Vatican II and the Student Revolution are now consistently proposed by Vatican leaders on the ecclesial front and by government leaders on the globalist political front. Therefore, it should come as no surprise if the priorities of Bergoglio's political program coincide with Joe Biden's priorities. Migration, environmentalism, Malthusian ecologism, gender ideology, the dissolution of the family, and globalism are common to the deep state and deep church agenda. Thus, Archbishop Vigano. Did all these men perjure themselves? Now, it is a striking fact that the soft modernists who were busy behind the scenes at the Second Vatican Council as periti or experts, working on drafts, schmoozing with bishops and cardinals, disseminating their spin through lectures and the media, all of these men had taken the anti-modernist oath of Pius X. So had Pope Paul VI, who, even if he was not himself a dyed-in-the-wool modernist, certainly had modernist sympathies and alliances, particularly in the domain of the liturgy, where his entire vision rested on the premise that the Roman Rite in its full Tridentine maturity no longer suited the needs and capacities of modern man, and for that reason had to be replaced with something artificially created by scientific experts from the field of pastoral liturgy. All of these men had taken the oath, and therefore it is hard to escape the conclusion that all of them were guilty of perjury, inasmuch as they departed from the affirmations to which they had solemnly sworn, placing their hand on the Holy Gospels. It is still more serious, not to say sinister, that Paul VI abolished the same oath against modernism on July 17, 1967. He had already abolished the Index of Forbidden Books the year before, the creation of which dates to the Council of Trent. The abolition of the oath, which had been in place for 57 years, came at the same time as the Concilium, the body in charge of implementing the liturgical reform, was busy pushing forward new Eucharistic prayers to supplant the Roman canon, which had been the definitive core of the Roman Rite for at least 1600 years. Only a few days after the abolition of the oath, on July 23, 1967, the fateful Land O'Lakes Statement was signed in Wisconsin, a statement that essentially severed Catholic colleges and universities from the magisterium and from the obligation to hold and teach the Catholic faith. In other words, the universities were doing in their own domain what churchmen and theologians were doing in theirs. The contemporaneous abolition of the oath and the Land O'Lakes Statement came not long before the Revolution of 1968, of which, as we have seen, the Council was a necessary precondition. In short, the oath against modernism was abolished exactly at the culmination of the doctrinal, moral, and liturgical triumph of modernism, as if to free the consciences of, quote, clergy, pastors, confessors, preachers, religious superiors, and professors in seminaries, unquote, from the burden of forswearing themselves on the Gospels. On this topic, Archbishop Vigano writes, quote, the abolition of the Iussurandum Antimodernisticum was part of a plan to dismantle the disciplinary structure of the Church, precisely at the moment in which the threat of the adulteration of faith and morals by the innovators was greatest. This operation confirms the intention of those who, in the face of the ultra-progressive attack initiated at the Council, not only allowed the enemy to have freedom of action, but also deprived the hierarchy of the disciplinary means with which to guard and defend itself. And it was a desertion, a betrayal of unheard-of gravity, especially in those terrible years. As if in the middle of full combat the commander-in-chief ordered his men to lay their arms down before the enemy just as they were getting ready to invade the citadel. Unquote. His Excellency adds, quote, the Revolution of 1968 found its ideological base in the Catholic universities and formed its most excited protagonists there, some of whom were political exponents of the extreme left. Not asking the professors of these universities and the chaplains of the lay associations to swear the oath was the equivalent of authorizing them to transmit their heterodox ideas, suggesting that the condemnation of modernism had fallen. This allowed the innovators to take power, according to the methods analyzed by Antonio Gramsci, who identified in the apparatus of the state, schools, parties, trade unions, the press, associations, the casemates of the enemy to be conquered in a parallel action to the war in the trenches. Unquote. Revisionist history. There is good reason to think that the moderate revolutionaries at the Council, it pains me to call them that, but I think it's the accurate term, Ratzinger, de Lubac, Congar, Wojtyła, et alii, later promoted the Council of the Media idea to exonerate themselves from responsibility for the Church and the world spinning out of control. That has remained the story of mainstream orthodoxy ever since. Don't blame the Council, blame the betrayers of the Council. We have seen plenty of reasons in this essay to call that naive account into question. Marcello Pera, an influential Italian intellectual, former president of the Italian Senate, and a close friend of Benedict XVI's back in the day, gave an interview in 2017 to the Naples newspaper Il Mattino in which he opined, quote, I would even say that, with Pope Francis, the Second Vatican Council has finally exploded in all its revolutionary and subversive radicalness. They are ideas that lead to the suicide of the Catholic Church, but they are ideas that were already supported and justified at that time and in that occasion. It is forgotten that the Council preceded in time the student revolution, the sexual one, that of mores and of modes of living. It anticipated them and, in some way, it provoked them. Unquote. It was not that Vatican II happened and then the world went crazy in 68. Rather, the world went crazy in 68 at least in part because Vatican II happened. It was the Church that opened the floodgates to the madness that has consumed our world. Until there is a decisive closure of those floodgates, the madness will continue to grow and morph into ever more sinister forms. Joseph Shaw comments, quote, "Tragically, the greatest global bastion of the anti-modern, the Catholic Church, succumbed in the 20th century to a modern mindset in a number of ways, precipitating a crisis which will clearly take many decades to resolve. She retains the substance of her sacred office, but has shed many of its symbols." Unquote. The shedding of the symbols, above all of the traditional liturgy, that forest of symbols, is a sign of rebellion before the claims of absolute truth and the norms of tradition that judge every age, especially an age that vaunts itself as superior to all others. In a parody of transubstantiation, the Church's sacred office substantially remains under foreign accidents. When the soul shall have taken up the body again, when the spirit shall once more clothe itself in flesh, we will see, in Henry Sears' poetic image of a future restored church, a rising of the phoenix from the ashes. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.